Hello, welcome to the Comic Book Commentary. I'm Bo Leidig, and this week I realized that I had not talked about Supreme in quite some time. So I figured it's probably time I address that and got back into it with Supreme number 2. So let's zoom in and take a closer look. First published in February or March of 1993, I'm not really sure. It says March here on the cover, but on the inside cover, it says February. So take your pick. I do really like this cover, though. It's, missing the little chrome foil type of Supreme logo up at the top. That's okay, that we saw in the first issue. But I really like the way that this one is displaying Supreme really kind of beat up, worse for wear, bleeding, cut open, carrying whatever this weird ass blade is. We're going to get into that inside the book. But it's showing him, having taken some real damage, despite the fact that he's supposedly nigh invulnerable. So we're seeing a little bit different side of Supreme in this issue. And I feel like this cover is really doing a very good job of, giving us that little glimpse of what's going to go on in the story of this one. Creator, co-plotter, Rob Liefeld. Penciler, co-plotter, scripter, colorist, Brian Murray. Inks, and this is where it gets a little bit weird, are Rob Liefeld, Danny Miki, and Brian Murray. If you want to pause the video and go through exactly which pages each one of them did, knock yourself out. I'm not going through all that. Lettering, Kurt Hathaway. Color separations, Digital Chameleon. Editor, Eric Stevenson. We see here on the first page, Supreme is just standing alone on a peak of a mountain, using his supervision, which we learn a little bit more later on in this book about his vision, but right now he's currently using it to just gaze upon the earth and taking a look at all of the new heroes who have popped up since his absence. He's been gone from the planet for 50 years at this point. And he also remembers some of his cohorts. Cohorts probably not the right word. Allies would be a much better word, that he used to run with when he was here on Earth trying to protect the world, such as Sentinel, but not the Sentinel from Youngblood, a completely different Sentinel, Glory, and Super Patriot. Now, I haven't gotten into any Glory on the channel, but I have Super Patriot both in the mini-series for Savage Dragon, if you want to go back and watch those videos, and also issue number 1 of Super Patriot, the original Super Patriot mini-series. I have a video up right now about that if you want to take a look at that. I recommend you do, because I love Super Patriot so much, and you'll see exactly why if you watch that video. Now, at this point, this is before that mini-series happened, so as far as Supreme knows, Super Patriot was basically taken out by the Vicious Circle and is no longer going to be able to fight crime. We haven't seen Glory appear at all in the Image universe. And again, I'm not sure what's going on with Sentinel here, as we have Sentinel in Youngblood, but he's obviously speaking of someone completely different. He mentions that they were all done in by their own mortality. And though Supreme does have the look of an older man with his white hair and appearing to be maybe in his late 40s or early 50s, he's actually much older than that. And it's assumed for right now that whatever powers he has either dramatically slow his aging process or make it so that even though he's aging, it doesn't really have a dramatic effect on his physicality and his body is not really degrading. We're not certain as of yet because it hasn't been explained. We then get this very cool 2-page splash image of Supreme looking across the entire world using his supervision and seeing all the different heroes of the early Image universe. Now, I'm going to go down the list real quick. We've got Brigade, Wildcats, Wetworks, the Savage Dragon, Youngblood, Shadowhawk, Cyberforce, Spawn, and then several of the prominent villains featured right here. Now, I have playlist on every last one of the different characters and teams that I've listed here. Feel free to check out those playlists if you want to learn more about all of these characters that you see here. But Supreme is actually wondering if these new superheroes realize exactly who they're working for and why, as he makes note of the fact that now mega corporations have created their own superhero teams and are funding them independently. But then there's also shadow government teams like Wetworks who are kind of working behind the scenes. You've got the public superhero team like Youngblood, who are working on direct behalf of the United States government, but the government has them at the forefront, basically using them as propaganda tools, as well as a peacekeeping force. And then you've got wild cards like Shadowhawk and Spawn, who are just working of their own volition with no funding. And then you've got a mercenary group like Brigade, and he's really just trying to make sense of what's going on with all these different superhero groups and where exactly they stand, and if they're fully aware of, who they're working for, why they're doing it, and if their motives really line up with those of the people who are pulling the strings. Supreme realizes that much has changed in his absence, but some things have stayed the same, and it's time for him to revisit his past, as we see him fly to some sort of maximum security prison facility that has like crazy energy walls. So assumedly this facility is for high profile supervillain types. And he goes immediately to the cell of a man named Grislock, who apparently in the past was one of Supreme's, if not his main arch nemesis. He then states that he's come to execute Grislock. Grislock states, "Oh, so you're no longer bound by the laws of man, I see. Well, why don't we take a little trip down memory lane then before you do this deed?" Now, we also see here that Grislock seems to not be totally fearful of Supreme, but it becomes quickly apparent that if Grislock does have any type of superpowers, these powers are incapable of harming Supreme in any way, and Grislock is completely defenseless in this situation. Grislock then goes into deep detail of how he's been quite busy over the last 50 years that Supreme has been absent from the planet, as he systematically hunted down and killed every person that Supreme cared about or loved, including a young man named Billy Nelson who worked for a newspaper. Again, Supreme is definitely a stand-in for Superman at this point in the Image universe. So you will see a lot of parallels between his backstory and that of Superman. Billy Nelson, of course, is the young news reporter that works for the newspaper. He gets hit by a truck driven by Grislock. Luis, not Lois, is Supreme's former love interest. He hunts down and takes out. He also goes to the trouble of killing the Junior Super Squad, which are young heroes, one by one. It even shows him actually like butchering their bodies here. Pretty gruesome. And then he goes on to continue and gloat, basically, saying the thing that made him the most upset over all this time was that he was going to all these lengths to torment Supreme, and Supreme wasn't here to see any of it. So he didn't get to witness any of the pain and emotional trauma that he was inflicting on Supreme. He then starts to go into a longer diatribe. However, Supreme wants to hear none of it, as he reaches out and grabs him by the hair, holds him up, and simply says die as he prepares to execute the final blow and eliminate Grislock once and for all. However, before Supreme can deliver the final blow, he is interrupted by none other than Skyraker from the superhero team Heavy Mettle. Those of you who have been watching the channel may recall that we first met Heavy Mettle in the pages of Youngblood number 3, and if you didn't watch that episode, feel free to go back and check it out. You get a little bit more backstory to the Heavy Mettle superhero team. Skyraker showing off exactly how powerful he is, as he's not only able to just grab and stop Supreme hot in his tracks, which is no easy feat, he then throws Supreme so hard that he blasts through the wall of the prison and then also through one of the guard towers. As he's doing this, he explains to Supreme that he's overstepping his bounds and that Grislock is under the direct protection of Heavy Metal. Now, as Supreme is flying through the air and before he can get his bearings, he is intercepted by Menagerie. Menagerie's powers are that he can kind of transform into any type of animal, but also like cryptids as well, or mythological animals, or perhaps animals from other planets. We're not that fully aware of exactly what these creatures are, if it's just whatever he imagines, or if it's, creatures from all throughout the galaxy. At this point, he's basically a giant kaiju lizard man, and he smacks Supreme out of the air onto the ground so hard that Supreme actually is buried down into the earth and creates a giant crater. He, of course, is then being intercepted by the other two members of Heavy Metal, which are Decibel and Riot. Decibel is a character with sonic powers, and Riot is a speedster. They're preparing to intercept Supreme, not taking him lightly as they realize just how powerful this adversary is, and they're not taking any chances. They want to make sure that they've got him down for the count before they let up on their attack. Also, I really do want to point out, it is impressive that Skyraker is so strong that he can just easily go toe-to-toe with Supreme with really no trouble whatsoever. Decibel instructs Riot to go after Supreme, and he immediately jumps into action. However, he does state that he feels like Supreme is kind of a pushover, as he doesn't seem to be putting up much of a fight. As Riot circles the crater and then goes straight down to start his assault, he realizes that all of his attacks are rather ineffective, and it feels as though he's basically trying to punch a mountain every time he hits Supreme. And then Supreme finally gets his bearings and fights back, launching Riot out of the crater and straight up into the air. Decibel then instructs Skyraker to go help Riot as he decides he's going to go up against Supreme. Pretty impressive, the level of teamwork that we're seeing with the Heavy Metal superhero team here, as when we were first introduced to them, they were constantly arguing with one another, bickering back and forth, and really didn't work effectively as a team at all. And it seems as though they've ironed out all of those wrinkles at this point and are a well-oiled machine as they continue their assault on Supreme. We are then transported to Gate Industries, and the leader of Gate Industries, Mr. Jason Temple, is arriving at the building and immediately takes control of command over the situation. And when he's briefed on what's happening, he instructs Decibel to hit Supreme with full power. As Decibel obliges him and continues his assault, Supreme is actually rather impressed by what his power set actually is. However, Decibel realizes that his attack is basically ineffective and that there's no way he can defeat Supreme on his own, and that if he can't get Supreme out of this crater so that the team can work as a unit together, they'll have no chance of beating Supreme and he'll just pick them all off one by one. So he launches him up out of the crater and he's grabbed by Menagerie. At this point, we see that Riot is actually spinning himself in place like a helicopter to try and slow his descent and keep himself from plummeting back down to the ground. He's grabbed by Skyraker, who comes back down and sees that Decibel and Menagerie are still fighting with Supreme, and he decides that this has, gone on for long enough, and that he needs to interject and end this battle now, as he lets go of Riot and flies into battle. Despite having the element of surprise, Skyraker actually alerts Supreme as he approaches from behind by screaming his name, and then somehow pulls out a completely legally distinct and absolutely not Batleth from Star Trek, and uses it to slash Supreme across the chest, which causes a huge gash, also cutting him across the face. And Supreme is shocked as he's actually feeling huge amounts of pain and is covered in his own blood. He can't believe that this has happened. He then realizes that this foe is fully capable of not only going toe-to-toe with him, but actually injuring him. And he has to use his X-ray vision and, well, I guess X-ray and just supervision in general to learn about this new adversary's physiology and biological makeup so that he can come up with some sort of way to counterattack and defend himself against this creature, as we see that Skyraker is not letting up on the attack and actually plans on killing Supreme if he can do it, as he raises his Not Batleth up above his head, trying to deliver a stab to Supreme's chest. We then get a 2-page vertical splash, which I don't even know why they went with vertical here. As you can see, the image of Skyraker in the background works both vertically and horizontally as it goes corner to corner. And the only reason that this is a vertical splash is because of the panels that are laid over top of it. However, we do get a really detailed and super cool image of Skyraker's internal biology. And at this point, as Supreme is analyzing it, he realizes that the physiological makeup of Skyraker actually defies all laws of physics, and goes into a whole bunch of scientific made-up mumbo-jumbo to explain it. But essentially, his body is nigh indestructible. And not only is it just his body, but his armor and his weapons are made up of the exact same physiological structure as his body, and can actually be healed and are part of him, almost as if they're, an actual appendage that's being produced by his body. And it's very confusing for Supreme, but he does realize that there is a weakness to it if he can change his own powers to match it. And this is where I was getting at earlier when I talked about Supreme's supervision. It's not just that he can use this vision to see far away or see, inside of creatures or buildings with like an X-ray type of thing. His mind actually uses this information that he gathers with his vision on a subconscious level and changes his body physiologically to handle whatever threat he's facing off against, which only adds to his incredible level of invulnerability and superpower. As Skyraker comes in for his second attack, he is intercepted this time by Supreme, who is not only ready for the attack, but able to defend against it, as he catches Skyraker's blade in his hands and then punches him square in the jaw, almost knocking him unconscious. As we see the rest of the Heavy Metal team come to Skyraker's aid, Decibel realizes that they're going to have to try a different approach here, and he now begins to try and reason with Supreme, as he states, we're not protecting Grislock because we like him. It's because he's an invaluable asset, not only to Gate Industries, but to our nation as a whole. However, Riot actually starts to interject here, stating that he actually agrees with Supreme and that Grislock is a horrible person that does deserve to die. However, Decibel immediately shuts him down and basically asks if Supreme will just listen to them out and give them 5 minutes so that Mr. Temple can have a meeting with Supreme and try and explain to him what they're exactly doing. Supreme says that there's nothing that's going to change his mind, but he will give them the benefit of the doubt, and he decides to accompany them back to Gate Industry and hear what Jason Temple has to say. As Supreme is escorted by the members of Heavy Metal back to Gate Industries, he asks, hey, where's that speedster at? And Decibel replies, oh, Riot, he's probably already been here for like 5 to 10 minutes. Inside of the building, Mr. Temple asks his second-in-command, Smithers, who is an obvious Simpsons reference, how long he thought this was going to take. And Smithers responds, you said it would take 70 minutes. He then asks, well, how long has it been? And he said, 70 minutes on the nose as of right now. And at this point, the receptionist calls in to say that Supreme has entered the building, kind of alluding that Jason Temple has some sort of abilities or high intelligence that is not being alluded to just yet. As Supreme enters, he's greeted by Mr. Temple, who offers him a glass of brandy, but Supreme immediately turns him down and says, you've got 5 minutes, don't waste them. He begins to tell him that there's much more going on with Gate Industries than what he sees before him. This is merely one of their facilities, and that they've got a lot of irons in the fire. Supreme is unimpressed by what he's seen and heard so far and tells Temple, yeah, okay, now you've only got 2 minutes left, so you may want to use them wisely. As we see that Skyraker is slowly kind of either changing or healing his arm in some way using his weird physiology that we don't quite understand yet. You can also see here in this earlier panel that his blade is now affixed to his back, I believe, but is in the shape kind of like a batarang. I don't know if this is because his blade can just change shapes to fit whatever it's doing. Obviously, if he's flying, it does make more sense for it to be in the shape of some sort of wing, or if this is just Brian Murray not drawing it the same way from one panel to the next. We're not entirely sure as of yet. As Temple and Supreme walk into a boardroom and shut the door, the Heavy Metal team begins to talk amongst themselves, and Decibel brings up the point that he doesn't see how Temple is going to make any kind of deals with Supreme, as he can't possibly have anything on him since Supreme left the planet before Temple was even born. However, Skyraker tells Decibel not to underestimate Temple and says that his influence is like a virus spreading far and fast across this planet and the universe. As Temple and Supreme then almost immediately enter the conference room, Supreme walks through the room, goes through one of the windows, and takes off with a sonic boom. So the Heavy Metal team immediately believe that Supreme has turned down the offer, and Decibel says, well, it looks like you can't get everybody on your side. However, Temple responds by stating, you underestimate me. Supreme's going to be back here at 4:30 in the morning as the new leader of Heavy Metal, and you're going to be starting your training ASAP. At this point, Decibel and Menagerie are like, oh, come on, man, that's super early. And Temple just tells him, well, then you better get to bed right now if you want to get an early start. We are then teleported out into the far edges of the Milky Way galaxy, where we see that a fleet of spaceships is approaching, and these ships belong to an armada that is from the homeworld of Combat, who is a member of Youngblood. His people are approaching Earth as they have noticed Supreme coming back there, and we don't know exactly what their motives are as of yet, as we find out that they were in fact allied with Supreme at one time, but we don't know where that allegiance stands at the moment. Inside of the ship, we meet Admiral Kirk. Another Star Trek reference there, folks, except it's spelled K''HRK. Obviously, they didn't want to get into any legal trouble, as he starts to ramble on about how Supreme is the most well-traveled individual in the galaxy and has charted more of the universe than any other living being or alien species anywhere in the universe at all. And he now wonders exactly where Supreme's allegiances lie and what's going to happen, as, you know, they fought valiantly side by side in the past, but he's not certain exactly what Supreme wants to do going forward, as we see the story is to be continued. Also, we notice a pretty obvious Klingon warship right here in the background. At least that's what it looks like to me. We then get to the letter section. Most of these letters are just complimentary, talking about how much they like Supreme number one. There is one letter where a reader is, basically trashing the whole first Supreme issue. But a lot of his criticisms are basically just like, I didn't think the artwork was good, and I didn't like that you put a chromium cover on the front. Which, okay, maybe. One thing I did find interesting, though, is that there were two separate letters where readers talked about how they thought that it was very interesting that Supreme was portrayed as being so arrogant. Obviously, he's based on Superman and, other beings in that type of wheelhouse. And, Superman is never arrogant and, self-serving the way that we see Supreme being. He tries to blend seamlessly in with humanity, whereas Supreme basically just walks around stating, I'm more powerful than all of you. None of you can stand up to me, so I'm going to do whatever I want, whenever I want, and no one's going to tell me what to do. Which is one of the reasons it makes it so intriguing that Jason Temple, in 2 minutes, was able to convince Supreme to take control of his superhero team and start working on his behalf, which really makes you question, what does Temple know, and what kind of information does he have about Supreme that would make Supreme change his tone so quickly? We then come to Infinity Part 4. Now, I can't remember all the issues that the other 3 parts of Infinity were in. I know Part 3 was in Shadowhawk number 2. So if you do want to watch that part, you can check out my video on Shadowhawk number 2. But the short version is Infinity was in a lab, suddenly broke free of the lab, had all these powers with no memory, and there was a time-traveling android that was helping her who disappeared, and also a subplot of a Senator Rife who is being targeted by Jeremiah Hagstrom, who is a high-ranking official in the CIA, who has been betraying the U.S., and Hagstrom hires this villain, Ripcord, to go and assassinate him. Now, Ripcord is sneaking up on a press event that Senator Rife is holding through the sewers so that he can move undetected, but he's then going to try and kill him in broad daylight. Infinity, meanwhile, has been flying around trying to figure out exactly what her next move should be, as she can't remember who she is, where she came from, where her powers came from, why she was in the lab, and then upon seeing a reflection, doesn't even know where her clothing came from or why it would ever look like this. However, when she looks inside of a storefront window, she can immediately transform her outfit with thought into the outfit she sees, which is very impressive. And she states that now she can at least blend in with society and go unnoticed. Meanwhile, at the press conference, Senator Rife continues to state that he has all the evidence necessary to expose all of Hagstrom's treason and plans on making an example out of him for betraying the United States of America, when he's suddenly interrupted by his adversary that he didn't know he even had. Of course, that adversary who interrupted Senator Rife is none other than Ripcord, who is still in the sewer as we see the manhole cover explode off the top of the sewer and 3 grenades fly out. As they explode, Ripcord reaches out with his mechanical tendril harpoon gauntlet thing that's his apparently main weapon, grabs Senator Rife and starts slamming him into the ground. He then jumps up out of the sewer and looks directly into the cameras of all the news media that were at the event and states that he plans on assassinating Senator Rife on live television, and just in case they wondered, his name is Ripcord, which is kind of crazy that he's just going to be like, yep, I'm going to kill a sitting senator of the United States government on live television, look into the camera, and announce my supervillain name to the world. Also, I mean, what a Rob Liefeld character here, man. Look at this. Half of his outfit is just shoulder pads and utility pouches. As he takes aim at the senator's head, he's interrupted from executing him by none other than Infinity, who states that he must surrender and stop trying to harm this man, who she doesn't know at this point. Ripcord is not impressed at all as he begins to fight with Infinity, dodging one of her attacks and then responding by shooting straight through her chest with several of his tendrils that don't seem to do all that much damage to her, despite the fact that she has 3 wounds right through the middle of her torso. He then uses these tendrils to slam Infinity into a wall and believes that he has easily defeated this new foe. Believing that he has won and that Infinity was actually a new member of Youngblood, Ripcord is actually quite impressed and pleased with himself and starts to gloat as he attempts to continue his plan to assassinate Senator Rife. However, he then realizes that one of his tendrils is not retracting, and that's because it's being gripped by Infinity. He turns around just in time to see her as she uses his tendril to swing him around like a mace, or a flail, I should say, and slam him into the wall of a nearby building. The wall then collapses on top of him as he screams out in horror, and Infinity holds onto his tendril still with her eyes aglow. I also certainly hope that no one was inside of this building as all this shrapnel and debris was flying around and half of it was falling over. Infinity then comes to the realization that despite the fact that she has no memory of any of her past, that she's clear on what her future should be and that it is to help as many people as she can. At this point, she walks over and picks up Ripcord's arm, and we see that though it's been ripped off, it's got a bunch of circuitry and wiring coming out of the back of the forearm, which now gives us the information that Ripcord was actually a cyborg. However, before she can think about this at all, she's approached by Senator Rife, who puts his hand on her shoulder and says, "Hey, I just want to thank you for coming to my aid. Are you a new member of Youngblood?" Infinity responds by stating, "I have no idea who that even is, but I am worried because this Ripcord guy managed to get away, and he's probably going to come back to try and do you harm once again." However, the senator states that given what he just saw and the condition that Ripcord must be in, he's not too worried about that right now, and that he's wanting to beef up his security, and then states to Infinity he wants to have a chat with her about a few things if she was willing to listen. And this is where we come to the end of the Infinity story. Now, Infinity does have an ongoing series, at least to some degree. I don't know how many issues it is. What I do know is that I don't have any issues of it, and I'm going to have to search those down if I want to continue making videos about the short-lived Infinity story. On the reverse inside cover, we get the back end of the letter section. Kind of weird that they would have split it at the beginning and the end of the Infinity story instead of just making it 2 full pages. But whatever, it's their book. They can do whatever they want. Again, none of these other letters are all that interesting. They're basically just going on and gushing about how wonderful they thought Supreme was and giving tons of compliments to Rob Liefeld and the other peoples who work at Extreme Studios. So there's not a whole lot to talk about there. And that was Supreme number 2. And overall, I thought it was a fantastic follow-up to the first issue. The story is super intriguing, creating mystery through ancillary characters. We also got a really good idea of exactly what kind of team Heavy Mettle is and their ability to work together and go up against a really powerful adversary like Supreme. I also liked the inclusion and conclusion of the little mini stories that we've had about Infinity. She does seem like an interesting character, and it's kind of a shame that she didn't have a more prominent role than she ended up having. But it is fun for me to go back and make these videos. Despite having quite a few Supreme issues in my collection, I had never really taken the chance to read them. I had just kind of acquired them through buying other collections or short boxes from people at yard sales or friends of friends. So it's, kind of interesting for me as someone who hasn't read these before to go back now and read through them and understand the character of Supreme better and how exactly he fit into the Image universe in the early days of the company. But then again, these are all just my opinions. You may think that this issue was terrible. You may not be interested in the Heavy Metal superhero team or Infinity or Supreme at all. But if that's the case, it's okay, because everyone's entitled to their own opinions. If you enjoyed today's video, please feel free to like, comment, and subscribe. And thanks for stopping by. Have a great day.